You said something on one of our unepisodes when you went through I'll call it a dry time in your PC time, when you didn't really
Yeah.
have the excess money to go buy a new rig, but you made it work. And I've had to make things work also in my music career as well. And I wanted to share some of the things that you learn by really having limited resources.
Right.
So let's launch out on the loop and discuss limited resources today on Curiosity Continuum. Hey everybody, this is
Hey,
Brian.
everybody. This. Oh, I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
I didn't
I'm
know
going to
you
throw
were
you
getting
off this
started.
time. I'm going to throw a curve so you say the last thing. Hey everybody, this is Brian.
And this is Josh.
Welcome to the podcast for Curiosity Continuum.
Curiosity Continuum is an industry-innovating, non-traditional company passionate about growing wisdom in the next generation.
We are the essential bridge between the analog and digital worlds by building collaborative communities that unleash the power of adaptive expertise and innovation needed to thrive in the 21st century.
We combine and mix essential elements needed to empower people to succeed in new ways not possible outside of a creative, thoughtful, diverse community of fellow curious people.
Follow us on your favorite podcast app to receive notifications of new content. If you like what you hear and want to dive deeper, visit us at curiositycontinuum.com. Thanks for tuning in, and let's start the conversation. And with that, I realized why sometimes the rhythm and roll isn't as automatic for me to say, because I'm always saying the same thing.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm like, oh, I'm saying something new, but I've heard it a lot. So anyway.
Right. I know. I do the same thing, and I'm like, sometimes it's not natural to say. So
I'm just going to set it up at the end. You're going to say, this is Josh. I'm going to say, this is Brian. And then you're going to say, for curiosity continues.
Okay.
Just to mess with people. All right. Sorry,
Okay.
folks. Okay. So limited resources. Let me share a story real quick about my own life and limited resources in the music world. For a long time, I only had one bass. Now, for some guys, they're like, you only had one bass? It's like, yeah, I had a bass. And that thing
Right.
better work because otherwise I was in
Right.
trouble. And fortunately, I've always had very well-performing instruments. I'm very particular about when I buy something. I take good care of it and make sure that, it's working well. You don't want to show up at a gig ever and have malfunctioning gear. It's just not cool. And with that, you need some backups as well. But I want to share a little bit because when I moved to Tennessee, I actually had kind of an amp that was kind of there. It wasn't a great amp. And I had one bass. And, I came to town and there was people who had multiple basses, multiple amps,
Sure.
and different
Yeah.
things. That's what I had. I mean, I really had a cable and a bass
Yeah.
and an amp.
You had
Which,
you had
for
a,
some
you had a
bass players-
situation that worked.
And for most bass players, you go, well, that's all you need. It's like, well, true. When you go into a studio, you're going to other situations, you need a little bit more tooling. But I'll tell you this. I was having a conversation with a younger bass player, and we're talking about pedals. So for those who don't know, there's effects, like special effects almost, that you add to your instrument, and
Right.
they're called stomp boxes or pedals. And depending on what it does, basically when you run your signal in from the instrument into this thing, it'll do something to the signal. It might make it sound distorted, like a guitar. Like if you hear an electric guitar kind of playing and then you hear it like overdriven or distorted, that's a circuit doing something to the signal to make it sound a certain way. And there's a whole variety of these things on the market, to make your sound different. Some of them are just more functional, like tuners. My situation was I never really felt like I had the money. In some ways, I didn't, to have all these fancy pedals. And for guitar players, it's very different. There's certain things that you need. But for bass players, you really don't. And as we were talking about it, I told the young player, I said, the reason why my right-hand technique is very consistent is because I never had the extra money to have a compressor pedal, to have special effects. I had to create the special effects with a very limited resource. It was like my hands and my ears and my instrument. And my instrument wasn't infinite. It did what it did.
Right.
There were certain things I could not do. But that really made me pay attention to understanding what I was working with and overcoming those particular limitations by the constraint of just having only one thing. But that really benefited me later to understand this is how this works. This is how I can make this work. And making something work is really the benefit of having a very limited resource coming into more resources. You kind of know what to do with it at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it's important to make something work, even to not to guarantee outcome, but to guarantee a result that you want, the desirable outcome, right? So I know we talked a little bit about this in the episode too, but it's kind of like that. It's like I have one thing I need to. I have a goal, an end goal to get. Like for you, it was like I got to play bass. I got to make it sound good, and I only have the bass. So figure it out, right? And so, but then you have to think to yourself, like, especially with like a bass, like, what did they do before all the fancy pedals and stuff? So you're like, they had to, they didn't, I know they didn't always do like distortions and stuff. They didn't always do all that stuff, but they did at some point. And then somebody came up with the idea of a pedal, and then kind of the rest is history there. So that is an interesting concept, though, to talk about, which is constraints, right? And everyone has constraints. So all these like resources are limited. I don't care if you're the richest man in the world or woman in the world, you have a constraint of something. It just might be different than mine. My constraint's the $20 that I have in my pocket, or these guys might be billions of dollars, but it's the same constraint. I mean, they're just thinking like we're thinking, but on much larger scales.
So when you approach it, one thing I really appreciate about first generation wealth builders is by the very nature of that title, there wasn't that same wealth in the previous generation.
And most people that are millionaires and billionaires are first generation. They're not come from money. I mean, if you look at the statistics, it's actually most people are. They actually worked for it.
There's something rewarding about having that be that way.
Mm-hmm.
Now look, and there's also now you see like generations of people where first generation built it. And the second generation that comes in, there is a really strong stewardship / stabilization / scaling thing that kind of comes in a different way when you now have that base level of resources. Right. But part of the thing when you really grow a business big or you've built your wealth is that you've found not only how to serve people in a certain way, right, regardless of what your trade is or what your industry is, where they're kind of saying thank you, and the show of their appreciation is dollar bills coming through. Trading like your time, your talent, your resources for that resource of money. It's a translation mechanism. And then what's happening is you're able to not only do that, but multiply it and then retain.
Now, yeah.
Right? I mean, some people are really great money makers and they just can't keep it.
Right. I mean, I always like joke about that with some people, that I know that some people are really good at spending money. They're also good at making money, so they have the money to spend. Like I'm good at making money, but I'm also good at like saving money, which a lot of people aren't. And so I try to like always be thinking about, for me, it's always like, I know this always devolves into money for some reason, because that is like I think the most resource that people can all have in common. Like we all need it, right? To some extent. And in the economy in which we live, we trade our time and our skills and our goods, services rendered, for money, which helps us, pay for my house, pay for my car, whatever. But it's
a portable.
Yeah, everyone knows, for example, in the United States, how long it takes them to make $1, and then once the government cuts out, it's like 40 cents of it. How much you have left, and then you just keep doing that over and over and over. And the government cuts it up even more, and then you get taxed on the taxes that you taxed on and all that stuff. So that is the one part about limited resources and money that is very, when you get older, and if you're younger, like listening to this, like Brian's son Isaac, he probably doesn't really feel the sting yet. But when you look at your W-2 and you're like, or you look at your taxes at the end of the year, look how much money I made. I'm like, why am I not rich? But that's kind of like, yeah.
Somebody
and so the
hand.
idea there would be to do more with what you have. And so that's what this whole thing is kind of pulling me towards, is how to do more with what you have and to work within that constraint.
And making it work. My grandparents went through the Great Depression. Yeah. They lived through it. Sabrina's grandparents lived through the Great Depression. Now, look, and I'll say this just from my vantage point, there's a point where you don't have to wash out the plastic bags again and again to reuse, even though like they're still valid and it's good. But there was no promise of another plastic bag that you could either A, have access to, or B, would be like useful. You used what you
Yes.
had to the full extent of what it is. In an economy and in a world where it's like, well, I'll just get another one. It assumes endless supply. The world has really come to realize that there's no such thing as an endless supply chain.
Right. And I mean, it used to feel
it's-
like that in the United States. I mean, we were very privileged to live here where I could go to Walmart and get anything I need. I had one of my friends would say to me one time, but like years ago, if it ain't at Walmart, I don't need it. Like, went to Walmart for everything. And I mean, changes oil, food, everything. That's the only place he shopped. Like I said, well, don't you ever go into Publix? He goes, that bougie place? No way. I'm like, and the guy had tons of money. So I was like, well, he's doing something right,
You see that there's the actual people who
Yeah.
keep their money, and then there's the people who look like they have the money.
I found in
Usually they're not
my
the same
life,
people.
especially my neighbor is that way. I love the guy. He's a nice guy to talk to. But he is in, crippling amounts of debt. And he's got 2 brand new cars. His daughter that is 18's got a brand new car. And he's got a boat. I got all this stuff. He's got nice clothes, which I mean, nice clothes. What I mean by that is like high-end clothing, not just clothes without holes in them, because that's my idea is nice clothes is that. But, yeah. And so it's like, what is that? I mean, I don't know how you function day to day with that amount of debt, and just realizing that payment comes every month.
There's you get used to doing life a certain
Yeah.
way, and
the outward appearance of it
when we
is
look
like,
at
and you also don't want to change because then that means there's something wrong, right? Like people will see that outward change because there's always a thing to that. Like, like your neighbor gets a new car and then you go get a new car, and then you're kind of like outwardly appearing that you're put together, even though you're not, probably.
it's usually against things that you feel like is an indicator of how well you're doing.
True.
And honestly, here I'll just kind of pick a topic and let people argue and things like that. When we talk about gas prices is something that affects
Yeah.
everybody, for better or worse, goes up or down.
It affects the entire economy from the top to the bottom, because fuel we need for transporting goods and services, transport ourselves, our everything. So
When you look at that, you go, well, has your behavior changed? Do you drive around less? Do you carpool?
I actually had this conversation with my dad a couple of weeks ago. I said, was complaining about gas prices, which my dad doesn't go anywhere anymore. He works from home. And I said to him, well, has it changed the way you do life? He's like, well, not yet. Then I go, then they're not high enough. And I go, that's the economist standpoint, right? Like, you raise prices on a good until it gets to the point where it changes the behavior of people. Then at that point, then you're like, okay, now we'll back off a little bit. And that's where the new price is going to be. I had one guy tell me right out when I was doing some consulting long years ago that because I asked him about his pricing structure, and he said, well, have you ever had somebody tell you it was too much? I said, no. He says, then you're not high enough. He goes, keep raising the prices on your services until you have people that say that's way too high. And he said, just back it up a little bit. And he goes, that's where you keep it. And I'm like, I never thought about that way. But that's also how you keep limited resources limited because if they can't be so cheap that everyone just goes and buys it. It has to be when you need it, you're going to use it. And so that's kind of an idea,
That very much is a revenue management 101 principle, where there's a curve basically of you could sell a bunch at a little, or like one at really super high margins. And somewhere in the middle of mixing that is the right spot to be. When everybody says yes, it's too low for probably what you're doing. Now, what that butts up against more than what the market will bear is actually your confidence to be able to present it.
And your moral,
And
do you feel moral doing that, Because you might feel like you're
Part of
taking
it.
advantage of somebody. But but you're
Yes.
not. I mean, you might. I mean, I guess that could be subjective. So
And let's say that you're not, let's say like you're not morally hurting the person,
Right.
right? The other dynamic that goes along with this is, do you feel like you're an imposter being there? Like presenting, like if you're like a service provider. I dealt with this when I first launched out on my own. Oh my gosh. I mean, like I deal with numbers all day, but the pricing conversation just made me
squirm.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Because I knew what it took to go find business, to have to buy my own insurance, to have the gear, to show up, to have the knowledge to be able to build it. It was worth it. And yet it was one of those things where I going like, but yeah, well, how can I do that? What was happening is that I thought, well, if they're going to hire me to do this, then maybe they're in the same spot I'm in. I don't know that. And I'm playing all these other assumptions versus just saying it dispassionately. And then at that point, if you need to walk away, if they need to walk
Correct.
away, but it helps to find the relationship. It's not a continuous thing. Because what happens often at that point is that it gets very tenuous trying to land where that price should be, and then you're giving more than you think you should, and you're getting frustrated, or they think they're giving more than they should, and they're getting frustrated, and it makes for a bad relationship.
And it's just breaking down the barriers, of like a good, healthy working relationship with somebody. Because now you're just thinking about the money. And on both sides, you're upset about it. But you won't talk about it.
And and that's just expectation management.
Yeah.
So oftentimes, like if you're a service provider, and let's say I'm going to go consult your business. You say it's $5,000 a month base retainer to be able to go do this work, right? Very reasonable retainer, especially if you're a large business. They might say, but it's a small business, might be like, that's my whole payroll for a month.
Yeah.
Right? And they say, well, I can't afford that. I said, well, let me understand what you're asking for. Why don't we change let's fit it within your budget to see if this works. What that does is it basically says, hey, you have limited resources, right? And I am also a limited resource. Let's come to an agreement about what's going to work
for both
here.
of us.
If it doesn't work, that's okay. We should actually call it before it ever gets started so that everybody knows that it's not going to work.
And there's no hard feelings that way, too. So when you're thinking about, I just want to, let's pull this all back together. I think that was a great kind of way to do that. But let's let's just pull it all back together. So resources are limited. Everyone should know that. And I think everyone does know that. But everyone's ceiling is different. So you might have, you might be talking about toilet paper and you might have hundreds and hundreds of rolls of it. Or you might be talking about toilet paper, you might have like 2 rolls, right? So obviously when you have hundreds of rolls, you might be more free with it. You're like, oh, hey, here you go. You have the toilet paper. You have the toilet paper. When you get down to 2, you're like, okay, guys, let's cinch this back. Let's ratchet this back a little bit. Same thing with money. When you have a lot, you might be putting. But what I'm trying to say, and I think Brian's trying to say too, is have the wherewithal to know that even when you have a lot of it, it's still limited, and you should be looking at it as such. And that actually means that you will always have that resource when you need it. Because there are times when you just need something, and if you don't have the resource, well then you didn't manage it correctly before.
You can learn from that too, but if you're stuck without toilet paper, it's kind of a big deal.
Yep. There's only so much you can do without toilet paper in your life. So.
And with that thought, let's put a comma here for the day.
Yeah, let's do that.
Remember, Josh, we promised you'd say it first.
Oh, yep.
You say first.
All right, we'll put a comma here. And for curiosity.
No, I said that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, you're just messing me up now. So what do you want me to say?
I'll be quiet. Just say your name, man.
All right. This is Josh.
And this is Brian.
For Continuum.
Sorry.
I just am so used to doing it the other way.
I know. That's why I wanted to just mess with you.
We'll leave it.